We can study the brain to understand how to manipulate consciousness, what the physiological conditions of consciousness are, but we're not going to explain where it comes from by studying the brain, because it doesn't come from the brain. The brain's a condition, but not a condition for consciousness, but not a producer of it, I would say. Immanuel Kant, if he were alive today, to take a look at all these different neuroscientific research programs that are setting out to explain consciousness as though it were some kind of brain mechanism, Kant would be slamming his head against the table because of how metaphysically confused that is. We need new words for what traditional religions would refer to as God. And I think consciousness is actually a decent candidate.
At age 11, Segall was already altering his state of consciousness through out-of-body experiences. By 19, psilocybin confirmed what he had long suspected, that consciousness runs far deeper than the brain. Today, he's an associate professor of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the CIS in San Francisco, author of Physics of the World Soul, and one of the leading voices in the global resurgence of Panpsychism, the ancient idea that mind isn't locked inside your skull, but threaded through all of nature. And he makes a damn convincing case, but don't just take my word for it. Remember to please subscribe to support independent science, and if you want to know why the universe might already know what it feels like to be you.
Many neuroscientists would say there's no evidence for panpsychism. Well, the evidence for panpsychism is the same evidence for any other metaphysical interpretation of what's going on. I mean, many neuroscientists take for evidence that the brain produces consciousness. For the panpsychist, it's just evidence that the brain is a condition for consciousness, but not necessarily its cause. Right? And so the metaphysical frame you take is going to determine whether you think it's a cause or a condition. There's no experiment that could decide that for you, other than dying. I mean, we'll all die one day and then we'll know, presumably. A lot of these neuroscientists would say, of course Descartes was wrong. There's no dualism. I'm a materialist. Well, but your materialism is beginning from that, after that Cartesian split. You're accepting Descartes' definition of nature, when we need to really rewind and question whether mind and nature should have been separated conceptually in the first place.
Segall. What I'm most interested in understanding is, what are the key pieces of evidence that make Segall, interdisciplinary scholar and philosopher, convinced that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe? Where does that story start for you?
Evidence is, in our time, thought of as, because it's a scientific age, we think of evidence in terms of empirical measurement. Can I record this on a camera somehow, or on some kind of detector? Can I then transform the signals, the data that I've observed from something tangible in the world into some kind of mathematical model, and then I can make predictions about it, and then go and see if those predictions are confirmed by the next observation that I make. And that kind of scientific measurement and modeling is, I think, a really powerful set of methods. But there's more to evidence, to what might count as evidence, than just what can be measured, which is why consciousness is an interesting question at all. It seems rather to be both entirely intangible, and it doesn't weigh anything. You can't see it. And yet, on the other hand, it's pervasive. There is nothing that we could measure or observe that doesn't presuppose its presence. We have to be conscious before we can observe anything else. And so it's nowhere to be found, and yet there's nothing else to be found that doesn't already require it.
Yes.
Right. And so, but, the way you phrase the question about consciousness being a fundamental property, that already kind of gives us an abstract picture of this phenomenon, let's call it. even that's not an adequate term for it, because it's also the noumenon, in the sense that consciousness is always going to be on both sides of these dichotomies. And so what counts as evidence? Well, our own first person experience, our own awareness is the primary evidence that we have for the existence of consciousness. And there's a whole tradition of philosophical reflection that understands consciousness in this sense as something transcendental. So it's not just a phenomenon. In other words, Immanuel Kant, if he were alive today, to take a look at all these different neuroscientific research programs that are setting out to explain consciousness as though it were some kind of brain mechanism, Kant would be slamming his head against the table because of how metaphysically confused that is. So consciousness is this transcendental condition, and whatever the structure and dynamics of consciousness are, they're what makes science possible. And so Kant's question, which is where I would want to start, as in terms of what is the evidence for consciousness and why it might be something you said fundamental. I think we have to approach it as the condition for the possibility of scientific knowledge. And if scientific knowledge of nature is possible, that tells us something important about what consciousness is. That consciousness is imbued with a kind of intelligence, a kind of agency, right? Because to do science, it's a purposeful activity. You're taking an interest in something called the truth. That already presupposes a whole bunch of stuff that science itself can't prove, that science itself can't go out and measure and model. Measurement and modeling is possible because of consciousness.
Getting accurate and unbiased information from the latest scientific research is critical for my job as a science communicator. That's why for over 1 year now, I have been doing all of my scientific research with Consensus.ai. You can think of Consensus as the ChatGPT for science, trained exclusively on research papers, so it doesn't give you that hallucinated garbage like ChatGPT. Recently, I've been in love with the new deep search function they just launched. Let's try it out. So I needed to learn about brain organoids for a podcast with Philip Ball. Let's run a deep search and see how Consensus helps me understand the entire breadth of a field in literally the shortest time possible. It filters through every paper on brain organoids, giving a really nice intro summary at the top. It comes up with this really interesting question: do brain organoids model human brain development accurately? And gives me a consensus bar on the evidence. It tells you the top contributors in different fields. This is a table I love: claims and evidence. It lists out the most relevant claims to your original search and ranks them by evidence. I mean, seriously, where was this while I was in college? I think that's about 20 hours of work right there in one button click. If you're a scientific researcher, a student in college, or you're simply curious and have questions about science, then I think Consensus AI is a complete no-brainer. And the best news is that you can use my link in the description to get a whole month completely free, so there's really no reason at all not to try it out, and it really supports the channel. Thank you so much.
So what is consciousness? It's not a scientific question in the sense of measuring and modeling things. It's a philosophical question, right? And so it's fundamental in the same sense, for the same reason that, for science to understand itself and its own conditions of possibility, we have to leave science and start to do something else, which, we could talk about phenomenology, we could talk about speculative metaphysics, we could talk about meditation and various spiritual practices. There are a whole set of different ways to inquire into what this mystery called consciousness is.
What's your general belief? What when you hear the word consciousness, throughout your career, you've been building this model of what it is. What is your most up-to-date idea of what you think consciousness is?
Well, again, it's a big word that people use in different ways, and it might be annoying for me to say this, but I think nowadays, because traditional religion is, at least in the academic world, not taken very seriously, we need new words for what traditional religions would refer to as God. And I think consciousness is actually a decent candidate. at least for starting a different kind of conversation um, about what it would require to really understand consciousness. Because again, it's not just it's not an object out in nature that science can study in the way that it might try to study any other natural phenomenon. And so how do we relate to it? Well, we relate to it uh, always already as a self-relation, because the evidence, again, that we have for consciousness is our own first-person experience, is our own sense of being able to uh, share a horizon of experience with others, and so it's not just my private experience that I have evidence of, it's my experience of being attuned to others and sharing a sort of intersubjective field. And when you study that, you're not studying the third person objects out in nature that science can measure and model. You're studying your own intentionality, your own will, your own beliefs, and the process by which you become more or less aware of yourself, your own frustrations, your sense of guilt for not having behaved. All of this stuff uh, comes up, which usually when you do science, you can just bracket. You don't need to worry about, am I a good person, or what should I have for lunch, or like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, these aren't questions that come up when you're just measuring nature out there, but because they do come up when you study consciousness, I think it's important to recognize that there's a spiritual side to it. There's at least a psychological side to it. It's all of a sudden these existential issues arise, and uh, there's a way in which you're involved in what you're trying to understand. Whereas in most of natural science, you leave yourself out. You can't do that anymore when you study consciousness. If you're seriously studying consciousness in the broader sense that I'm talking about, not if you're confused like so much neuroscience is today about. I mean, neuroscientists do great work, but I think the confusion is around imagining that some kind of brain mechanism would be able to explain consciousness. We can study the brain to understand how to manipulate consciousness, what the physiological conditions of consciousness are, but we're not going to explain where it comes from by studying the brain, because it doesn't come from the brain. The brain's a condition, but not a condition for consciousness, but not a producer of it, I would say. So that's where I've gotten. I don't pretend to know what consciousness is, because again, I think that's the wrong question to ask. The question to ask, if you want to understand consciousness, is also, who am I? And I can't answer that for you. So we're always going to be engaged in a very different type of inquiry when we explore consciousness, because I don't know that there's a final answer to the question.
Yeah. I love the difference in response I get to that kind of question if I'm speaking to a neuroscientist versus a philosopher. It's just it's an entirely different response, and that's why I love to speak to both, because you get so many different perspectives. Like, it's fun to hear you say with confidence that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, when still sort of the leading neuroscience theories, ideas would be that the brain, the body, the biological system generate consciousness, produce consciousness. Consciousness emerges from it. There's different ways of phrasing it that annoy different camps depending on what you believe. But why would you be confident that the brain doesn't produce consciousness?
Well, the brain can perform all of the biological functions that it performs without consciousness. Or if a neuroscientist wants to say that consciousness has, and there are some who would, that consciousness has a downward causal effect on the body, and so that there's a bottom-up emergence of consciousness through neurophysiological activity, but then somehow when it does emerge, this global emergent property called consciousness is able to, like, decisions matter. Like the consciousness is actually having a causal effect on the behavior of the body.
Yeah.
Then metaphysically, I have a lot of questions about how that is possible and what is meant by causality. But I think to speak to the neuroscientists who would say it's just epiphenomenal, consciousness has no causal power. There's no emergent whole that has downward causative effects or anything. Then I start to wonder how it ever could have evolved, because there's no way for it to get selected for, right? And so there's those two positions, right? The emergentists who would say consciousness is real and has some downward causative effect, even if it is produced by the brain. And then neuroscientists who would say, oh, no, it's just an epiphenomenon. I think for the epiphenomenalists, it's like, okay, this couldn't have evolved. Where did it come from? Why does it exist? Why are we conscious? Some of them will be eliminativists, and they'll just say, well, we're not actually conscious. We have words that we use that we think refer to this consciousness thing, but we're just confused. And that's a real, eliminative materialism. It can be a sophisticated position, but it seems hard for me to take it seriously because of how experientially inadequate it is. It's like, no,
Yes.
we're aware there's something happening here. There's a mystery here. You can't just dismiss it. But then, in the epiphenomenalists, yeah, you understand why I think there's something missing there. For the emergentists, though, when you say that the brain produces consciousness, and there are, a variety of different attempts to try to tell a causal story about how that emergence might occur, but to my mind, I've never actually seen an explanation. I've seen a lot of category errors from my perspective as a philosopher, a lot of category errors, but how you could actually go from matter understood as completely devoid of anything like purposiveness or agency or interiority or feeling to all of a sudden gain this capacity for inner awareness and affect and emotion. And there's an ontological difference there. It's not a difference of degree. It's not like if you arranged a bunch of material bodies in the right way, all of a sudden something like consciousness is going to come out of that. How is the arrangement of any very complicated arrangement of matter suddenly going to be anything more than just a complicated arrangement of matter and become aware of itself? Like, there's a huge gap there, and I've never really seen a good explanation for how to leap the gap. So I'm led, to this more panexperientialist or panpsychist view, and there's a whole variety of different kinds of panpsychism, some of which I disagree with, but there's a certain tradition, process philosophy that, comes out of in the 20th century, people like Whitehead. I think we could go back to Schelling in the 19th century in his philosophy of nature, which was also of this sort of flavor of panpsychism where there's a process dimension to it, and we understand experience not as something produced by certain arrangements of matter magically, but rather experience is just what's going on inside of material processes at every scale. Wherever there is some kind of energetic transmission occurring, there's also an experiential transmission occurring, some kind of Whitehead calls them vector feelings or prehensions. There's a flow of feeling through the world. And when we talk about causality and we measure it in terms of and calculate it in terms of energy, that's our objective external description of what on the inside is something more like feeling. We could talk about consciousness, being fundamental, or we could be a little bit more fine-grained about the words that we use and say, well, consciousness does require a very complicated nervous system, maybe even language, or some degree of symbolic capacity, whereas experience or feeling or affect might not be conscious in that sense, that it's self-reflective, but still there's awareness, there's a Whitehead would say self-enjoyment at every level of physical organization. So because I think these frames, whether it's the eliminativist, the epiphenomenalist, the emergentist, each one has major theoretical problems, I think. I found myself sort of backed into panpsychism as the best solution to those problems, right? So consciousness isn't produced in the brain. Consciousness and matter are just two sides of the same coin, and we need to go back to Descartes, where the dualism happened, because it's at that point uh, that what we thought of as nature was severed from our own inner experience of being alive. And then we went about trying to model this half of reality that we'd severed ourselves from, as though that could produce us when we'd already left ourselves out of it from the beginning, right? And so we need a different scientific philosophy of nature behind science than the Cartesian dualism. Because a lot of these neuroscientists would say, of course Descartes was wrong. There's no dualism. I'm a materialist. Well, but your materialism is beginning from that, after that Cartesian split. You're accepting Descartes' definition of nature, when we need to really rewind and question whether mind and nature should have been separated conceptually in the first place.
Right. Really well explained. I think really well broken apart. I joke that the longer I do the podcast, the more radical I get. And, 100 episodes later, I certainly start falling into the panpsychist camp. Who knows, maybe earlier. I think I started off the podcast being very strongly materialist. I studied neuroscience in college. That was sort of the only framework that was remotely taken seriously in my college, in my degree. I remember, I think panpsychism was literally given 2 minutes in one of my integrative neuroscience lectures in like third year, I think. And he literally kind of just threw up the slide as panpsychism at the top, and he was like, "There's no evidence for this. We'll move on." And that was not even exaggerating. That was literally the rundown that we got of that set of ideas. So I didn't know anything about it in college. But as I talked to more and more people, it gets harder and harder to draw the line in the sand of where consciousness is and where it isn't. And I, like you, very much struggle, like everyone, struggle with this idea of like how you get from matter to experience. But I think where I am at the moment is consciousness did emerge, but it emerged very, very, very early on in very extremely simple biological systems when they started integrating information in their environment and having a subjective perspective, a view, an agency in the world. And I think, this is very much informed by Peter Godfrey Smith's work. I like a lot of Mark Solms's work, how consciousness as an allostatic control mechanism for an organism to feel its way through a hard problem. I like that framing. And it seems to me plausible that this happened very, very early on, as these very early organisms started to sense the environment, make meaning from that stimuli, and then start weighing up decisions like, okay, this chemical gradient over here, responds, it means food. This chemical gradient over here means that there was a predator last time. And then it starts to build a memory. And then as the organism integrates those features, I think integrated information is key. In my view at the moment, although a lot of people have pointed out that they don't like this, that's where feeling emerges. It's extremely early on. So I'm, all the way to bacteria are conscious, plants are conscious, because they're integrating information about their environment. And that is what subjectivity is. And we have this incredibly rich subjective sense of consciousness because we're integrating billions of factors all into this one self-referential generative model. It's encapsulating so much, and that's why we have all these rich models, but it goes the whole way down the domain of life, and they have experience because the features that they're integrating into their subjective self. Does that make sense to you? I'm really curious on what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think I've heard that described, your position, as a kind of biopsychism. So it's not all the way to panpsychism, but consciousness and life are coextensive in some sense. And that instead of looking at complex nervous systems for some kind of causal story about how consciousness emerges, we should be looking at single cells, not brains, but membranes. And I think that's a positive direction for the research program of consciousness studies to move in. Absolutely. I'm really, deeply influenced by people like Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson, and this kind of autopoietic and enactive approach to these questions,
Right.
where as Evan Thompson phrases it, there's a mind-life continuity. He calls it the mind-life continuity thesis. And so as soon as you have a living cell that's self-producing, you have a kind of what they would call operational closure. You're referring to the capacity to integrate information. And these aren't identical understandings, but they're in the same ballpark. Then you have as soon as you have that operational closure, in their terms, that self-producing dynamic, where you have a system whose parts produce themselves for the sake of a whole, then you have an interior horizon of experience. You have a sort of hedonic gradients and a sense of yum and yuck, right? And this, I think, there's clearly at the level of cellular life, once you get biological organisms as we understand them here on this planet, there's a new threshold that's been crossed. But from my point of view, the same hard problem of consciousness that applies, to neuroscience, you could extend that to the question of the origin of life, and it's it's an identical question, really. You had physics and chemistry understood mechanistically, or understood in terms of quantum field theory, and which isn't really a mechanism anymore in the sense that there's no local efficient causation. There's something else non-local going on, and it's a very bizarre thing. But let's just say you have physics and chemistry understood as lacking anything like experience or feeling or agency or purpose. And then all of a sudden, because some bilipid membranes glommed onto each other, and you got some interesting chemistry going on inside that was different from what was going on outside. All of a sudden, now there's feeling. I mean, I don't have a causal story for how that's possible, and I don't even know how I might imagine one.
Yes.
And so it's the same. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. The origin of life is another hard problem, but I think it's less hard than it is just impossible if you accept a certain framing. So if you accept the Cartesian framing about the mind-body relationship, or you forget that you've already decided that there is such a thing as a material world totally lacking in interiority, it's just external and you can measure it reductively, so that there's no remainder. If you have that picture of nature, then of course you're going to have a hard problem of consciousness, or you're going to have a problem of where life came from. And I mean, there's a whole interesting history and philosophy of trying to understand these different sections of nature, right? The mineral realm, the plant realm, which is alive, but plants and animals seem to be also of a different order of magnitude. There's just like the move from physics and chemistry to the first living cell, the move from plant to animal, which, these are just general categories, not necessarily scientific categories, but there's clearly something about an animal's interiority that's vastly richer than a plant's interiority. But I do think plants are sentient. I'm not saying they're not sentient, but there are these various, nature seems to organize itself in terms of these leaps. But the question is, what do all of the leaps presuppose?
Yes.
And I think all of these leaps presuppose even the first leap to a hydrogen atom, a very complex self-organizing system in a way, compared to the plasma and the free electrons and protons that preceded it. Actually, what we think of as protons and electrons after the emergence of a hydrogen atom, they're changed by that symbiosis, when a proton and electron come together and become hydrogen. Now, whatever electrons and protons were before that, we can kind of guess or infer and speculate, and we do have plasma dynamics and whatnot, but the whole universe was changed when atoms emerged. Just like, the Earth, all of the matter anywhere near the surface of the Earth and pretty far up into the atmosphere exists in the form that it does because of the processes of life over billions of years. In other words, the composition of the atmosphere, the very tectonic plate system is seemingly driven by, the accretion of calcium as a result of organisms in the ocean that weigh down the plates. I mean, and so what we think of as just dead matter on the Earth is actually the result of life, right?
Right.
So, my point here is just there are these different levels of organization in nature, clearly, but what do all of them presuppose? And I think all of them presuppose some degree of agency and or aim and feeling or
Yeah.
subjectivity, right? And so I think subjectivity is just as fundamental as objectivity, which I think should be obvious when you start to think in a non-dualistic way, but in a maybe in terms of polarities. It's like, how could you have objects without subjects? How could you have an external material world without a mind there to know it?
Yeah. I like that line. Another rephrasing that I really liked. I was speaking to Nikolai Kukushkin, who's a memory neuroscientist, and he was like, "We need to stop thinking about biological matter as like dumb, inert matter. Like maybe a better way to think about it is information, because stored within these, dumb, inert matter is essences, is ideas, is like vibes almost. There's something a bit deeper there. Like if you're to think about what DNA is. Like, is DNA matter or is DNA information? And I think in terms of a useful way of thinking about DNA, I think information is much more a useful way to think about what DNA is. It's information. And then it doesn't explain, there's still explanatory gap, but I think unraveling information and integrating information into something like consciousness is less of a jump than dumb matter into consciousness. And again, it's not just, oh, that's it, but it's like just a simple reframing that I've had of like, okay, maybe the right way to think about biological systems isn't matter and how matter becomes mind, but how information, which might be the better way about thinking about what biology and biological matter is information. And then integrated information can, what Nikolai calls it, like unfold into something like consciousness. And again, that's not problem solved, but it's like that's maybe a smaller chasm to leap over than this matter to mind idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I think information is a very useful concept. Um, we have to be careful how we're defining it, the way that I think
Yeah.
Claude Shannon defines information in a very sort of instrumental way as a measure of uncertainty. And it's presupposing that there's a sender and a receiver of a message. And then that, in other words, it's presupposing that there are conscious minds who are trying to communicate something. And then it allows us, to measure the uncertainty in the signal across a channel. That definition of information is very, um, easy to operationalize, and it's why we're able to have this conversation. But then information often gets used, I think, in the more philosophical way that you're probably intending it now.
Yes.
And I think then it's a matter of being careful when we ontologize information to say, well, matter or DNA or anything that we would otherwise think of as physical is actually information, because information has been defined historically in science as, it's a way of measuring something, a physical process. And so if we say or start to think of reality itself as made of information, the risk is that we're doing something on par with like imagining that reality is made of meters or inches, or it's a map territory thing, right? And so when we talk about information, Shannon analogized it to entropy, and now in physics, because there's so much emphasis placed on time symmetrical models and formalisms, that most of the laws of physics, besides in thermodynamics, it doesn't matter which direction time flows. It's the determinism works either way. That's that tempts us into thinking of information or entropy or the irreversible flow of time as just a function of the limit of our knowledge, and that we would need to use statistics and probability to understand nature is understood epistemologically. Well, that's just a limit of our ability to know, instead of understanding probabilities and possibilities as something ontological, like that nature itself isn't deterministic. It's not just because of limits of our ability to know the initial conditions and chaos, and we can't know the position exactly of every particle right now. Therefore, we can only have statistical knowledge of the future. It's like, no, actually, there's something about nature itself that uh, is open-ended, right? And so, I think if we're going to say information is what the physical world is really made of, what we're actually saying is that the physical world includes um, tendencies and possibilities alongside what's already been actualized, right? And so we're saying um, nature isn't just a bunch of bodies banging into each other. To say that information is a better way of thinking about what nature is doing is to say, um, to me, it's another way of talking about what I was saying earlier, aim and subjectivity, but it's information implies there's a formal causality going on in addition to just pushes from behind. There's also a formal causality and a final causality. Information implies intention. There's something trying to communicate itself. And so, if that's what's meant by information and these information ontologies, then I'm on board. But I think sometimes there's a lot of conflation of different meanings of information. So we just have to be careful with how we define the term.
Yeah, I completely agree. Information has been one of those concepts that's been racking my brain and destroying it for a while, because I've had physicists on the podcasts that tell me that, information could be the bedrock of reality, and theoretical physicists saying that information might be a better way of thinking about what is at the foundation of everything than matter. But that doesn't make any sense to me, because, as you say, information is usually talking about some arrangement of something or some structure or some pattern of something. So how can something that is about, giving a relational quantity or describing something else be more fundamental than the thing that it's describing? That doesn't make any sense to me. How does information fit into panpsychism? Because maybe this is wrong, but in my mind, panpsychism was making sort of a crucial claim about information being at the bedrock, and experience is somehow linked to information in a way that I don't know if we fully understand. But I'm curious for you to talk around that for a bit.
You know, I think of Gregory Bateson's definition of information, which is a difference that makes a difference. And I would add it's a difference that makes a difference to somebody. In other words, information is always observer relative. What counts as information is going to depend on um, the perspective one is taking, uh, which is part of what the enactivists and the autopoietic theorists mean by operational closure. They have this argument, like Evan Thompson in his book Mind and Life, 2007, and Francisco Varela had argued this at length elsewhere too, that what counts as information is always going to depend on the organism, the perspective of the organism in question, that there's no way for information from an environment as if it exists ready-made out there independent of a particular organism's perspective is going to like come into the organism. The organism is always determining based on how it's perturbed by its environment what counts as information. Most of what is going on in this room around me right now isn't relevant to me, and I don't count it in my consciousness as valuable information. Most of what's happening around each of us at any moment is totally ignored, and the information that comes in is more a function of what we're looking for, right? And so certain chemicals for single cells become identified as food, and others are as sources of pain, or they're toxic. What that information about the world out there isn't just free floating in the world out there. It's relative to this organism's perspective, right? And so when you start to recognize that information is a difference that makes a difference to somebody, then you stop imagining that um, there could be such a thing as information without perspectives that are interpreting it. And
Yes.
so you can also think about this in terms of semiotics. There's a philosopher, I mentioned Alfred North Whitehead earlier. There's also a American philosopher named Charles Saunders Peirce who thought about nature physically, biologically, psychologically, culturally in terms of sign exchange and sign interpretation. And so another way of thinking about information ontologies is in terms of semiotics in Peirce's sense. And whether you go Peirce's route or Bateson's route or the inactivist route or Whitehead's route, there's a way of understanding understanding what information is that presupposes some kind of a horizon of experience or an interpreter, an observer, a perspective on the world. And you don't get information unless there are perspectives.
Am I wrong then in connecting panpsychism to information?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, my point is that information presupposes that there are consciousnesses or psyches or minds that are providing this horizon of
Right.
experience, a perspective on the world, such that there is information. You don't get information without perspectives on the world. So yeah, I think information as something real, more real than matter, implies panpsychism.
Right. Okay, great. So, something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it. How can we meaningfully talk about the universe having imbued with this experience? Is there a useful way that we can compare the experience of the universe to the experience of an electron, to the experience of my water bottle, to our experience? Is that the right way to think about it? Are they fundamentally different experiences? They're imbued with the same stuff. How should we think about them in relation to each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one way of trying to imagine other forms of experience beyond what we usually think of as human conscious experience is to just uh, consider the possibility, at least, that when you dip your hand into water or you drink water, that you're actually the taste of the water and the feeling of it going down your throat, or the feeling of your hand submerged in the water, that you're actually feeling what it feels like to be water, mixed in with all the other things that it feels like to be you. But, another example would be with sunlight. Like, what does it feel like to be the sun? Or what does it feel like, to be a photon? Well, maybe when we're, feeling that warmth on our cheek, there's some aspect of that feeling that is actually what it's like to be the sun. We just get a little taste of what it's like to be the sun, because there's
Interesting.
the way that energy is transmitted is actually also the transmission of feeling from, one being to another. Um, and so rather than, I think, the usual way of imagining our own conscious human experience as something produced by the brain or by the nervous system, um, we think of it as just totally hallucinatory, and that, you know, what we perceive as the color red out there in nature isn't red at all. It's just a certain wavelength of, photons. Well, what if actually we're not hallucinating and our consciousness isn't cut off from nature in that way, that we're wearing virtual reality goggles or something? What if, y- is there any reason not to suppose that actually, when we experience sunlight as warmth on our face, that uh, the photons that are conveying that warmth also themselves experience something like that? Um, it's a weird thought, maybe at first, but I think what
Yeah.
I'm really trying to do is rewind the clock. It's not that Descartes caused this. Descartes was describing a way that people were coming to feel themselves, in the 17th century. Um, and then his descriptions really caught on and gave rise to a particular approach to science, natural science. But I'm trying to get us to go back to before that dualistic split occurred, to bring mind and matter back together again, because the concepts that we use to think about our experience do end up changing our experience. And so as we come up with new ideas about what consciousness is and what nature is, we're actually going to change, we're going to alter our perception, I would say. That's what's really exciting about philosophy. It's kind of, philosophy is psychedelic, potentially, in the sense that it's mind altering. It it leads to shifts in our perception. We're not just coming up with new ways of talking about the world. We're coming up with new language in the hopes of transforming our experience of who and what we are. And so, to think beyond Descartes, to think beyond this mind matter dualism, um, it's going to kind of seem strange at first. Like, what the hell is this guy talking about? The photons feel warm, or what? I mean, uh, but once you see how that split between mind and matter isn't necessary, that's one particular way of thinking about it. Um, Once you see that there are other ways, then maybe it's not so absurd, to imagine that when you have a drink of water, you're feeling a little taste of what it is like to be water.
That's a strange one. I just spoke to Dr. Robert Prentner for the second time,
Oh yeah, I know
who is a
Robert.
colleague of Donald Hoffman, who I think that's you mentioned putting on the virtual reality goggles.
Hmm.
The simulations that they've done seem quite convincing to me, at least, where they've ran these evolutionary game simulations, and then they can determine that agents will evolve based on fitness rather than truth. So they will evolve features based on what is evolutionarily useful for their survival rather than is truthful in an objective reality type sense. And that kind of makes sense to me. I think this idea, that our perceptual system are evolved convenient truths for the optimal survival of our species, I think is very coherent and also non-dualist. I think there's nothing maybe dualism required in that. I think you can be a monist and still that is perfectly coherent. Where do you have any issue with that? Because I also thought there might be a lot of alignment between his conscious agent theory and different forms of panpsychism. I think in that the conscious agent theory says that sort of the universe and everything we inhabit is built up relationally through the interactions of conscious agents, and that consciousness is a fundamental force in the world rather than being a property of biological wetware and biological substrate. So I thought there would be some alignment there, but what you said about perception there is maybe not aligned with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of convergence there. I've met Robert, and I have never met Donald Hoffman, but the conscious agents theory, um, there's a very um, interesting and complicated mathematical formalism underlying that, and I think there's no reason that we need to construe it in terms of consciousness simulating or hallucinating reality, and that we only interface with the world out there through a VR headset, and so have no access to truth. I think that, you know, the evolution of organisms is always also the evolution of environments, right? The organism and the environment were never separate from each other. The agent and
Right.
the arena are not separate from each other. And so why say that? In other words, we think of truth as like, okay, well, there's an agent or there's a subject, and it's to have a true relationship to what's happening in its environment. It's got to have an internal picture that lines up and is in some way isomorphic to whatever's out there in the environment. But like that sort of a truth relation, um, that understanding of truth, it's like forgetting the coupling of agent and arena, such that like the evolutionary process was never such that a subject was separate from an object or an agent was separate from an arena. The arena is just a bunch of agents in relationship. There's no environment separate from the relationships among the agents composing it. And so we don't need to imagine truth as somehow outside of or not accessible to those agents, as though there really was a difference between what's going to allow an agent to survive and what a true representation of a supposedly external, a separate world would be. So I think, I don't know if you've read any Nietzsche, but there's this account of how the true world became a fable, and he goes through all of Western philosophy, and he talks about the appearance reality distinction, and that he really wants to question this idea of truth as something that would be behind appearances that we could finally unveil. And he says, well, there is no such thing as that. That was just a kind of power play, and all there are. Well, he says, well, then does that mean that there's only appearances? Well, no. If there's no truth reality dichotomy, then appearance is not mere appearance, right? And so I hope I'm uh, you know communicating this point clearly. I think that their model is brilliant, but we don't need to think of what it implies as suggesting that we have no access to truth. If agents and arenas co-evolve from the beginning, we have to come up with a different concept of truth that's not this representational thing where a separate subject has a little picture of a separate object that somehow
Yes.
lines up. Truth becomes, we need a relational definition of truth that allows us to feel like we are actually in contact with a real world out there, where the real world out there on this bottle is other conscious agents, right? So this is, hopefully my point's being conveyed. I'm not sure.
No, I think so. It's one of the parts of the theory that I didn't particularly understand either, was that he said that the more complex the perception, the less likely it would be to be true in an objective sense. And I never really understood exactly where that came from, but he was like 100 when we went, and the convenient fictions go all the way not just from color but to like space time, and that stuff gets really strange to me about how even the space time itself is a convenient fiction in our desktop VR goggles. And that stuff is truly truly weird. I didn't really fully understood that, although the other takeaway from the game simulation makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another convergence with my own perspective metaphysically, that, space and time are a kind of interface,
Yeah.
and our common sense, even in relativity theory, space time is objectified as if it's some kind of a block out there, and our experience is just as Einstein would say, a temporary illusion, a stubbornly persistent illusion, as he put it in a letter to a friend's widow. But um, I think that's not even really accurate in terms of relativity theory to think of it as a block. I mean, the space-time block, so called. But it's whatever space and time are, it's clearly something that's relative again to our own neurophysiology and to our the structure of our organism. Um, and so we do need to go beyond space and time to understand reality. I just think there's an element of our experience that already is beyond space and time, and we don't have the type of culture and established practices and the language for really talking about that aspect of our experience, because most of our words refer to spatial relationships and time relationships, and we have words for emotions and inner states and whatnot, but um, we haven't really cultivated uh, language so as to help us navigate. Even the word navigate already implies space and time, right? But to help us live into this other aspect of our experience. And I think if we did
Yes.
attend to that aspect of our experience, we'd see that while space and time can deceive us, we also have access to reality. We're not just living behind VR goggles. We're in real contact with each other and with the universe. It's just that the contact is subtler than we have imagined when we forget that space and time are a kind of interface.
What is the right way to think about the self in a panpsychist view? Something that I've always been unsure about is, is there some interaction between the biological system and this fundamental force of experience that are interacting in some way to create me, to create Evan, to create Matt? Is it the interaction between biology and experience? How exactly does that work, or how do you think about that?
Hmm. Well, just as an orienting metaphor, instead of thinking of the brain as a local producer of consciousness or of the self, what if the brain, the whole nervous system, our organism, is a kind of receiver or antenna or tuning fork that enters into resonance with fields um, around us? And in that sense, the body and our nervous system and our brain is it's certainly a condition for and um, one of the required ingredients for producing something like my experience of myself. Um, I I do think that when I die, when my body decays, that some form of experiential continuity will like persist, but I don't know that it will be recognizable as me, as I experience myself with the
Interesting.
body, right? So I think there's a way in which this is how Bergson understood it. I think this is how William James understood it, that the nervous system and the brain is actually a limiter of a field of consciousness or a continuum of experience that's far vaster and perhaps less differentiated, and that what bodies do is differentiate or limit or put a reducing valve, so to speak, on what Bergson or
Interesting.
I think it was Huxley actually called mind at large, right? Aldous Huxley.
Yes.
Um, and so it's an inversion of the usual picture, but I think the evidence, the materialists and um, many neuroscientists would say there's no evidence for panpsychism. Well, the evidence for panpsychism is the same evidence for any other metaphysical interpretation of what's going on. I mean, metaphysics isn't in the business of um, performing experiments, but in interpreting the experiments we already have in place and trying to bring them into coherence with some of the you know rational presuppositions of science. Um, and so what many neuroscientists take for evidence that the brain produces consciousness for the panpsychist is just evidence that the brain is a condition for consciousness, but not necessarily its cause. Right. And so the metaphysical frame you take is going to determine whether you think it's a cause or a condition. There's no experiment that could decide that for you other than dying. I
Yeah.
mean, we'll all die one day and then we'll know, presumably.
I find it really interesting because I agree with you. I think that there's equal amounts of non-evidence for both idealism and materialist worldviews. And I'm kind of wondering, why is it that one person can read about that amount of information, read about the non-evidence, and like what orients someone towards materialism, what orients someone towards thinking consciousness is fundamental? Is it more of a how they want to make meaning of the world, or like where they find individual purpose? Because they're both looking at sort of the same set of facts and coming up with kind of completely different epistemological worldviews. And look, what is it that orients someone in more of a material view? Is their particular brain wiring that it's less woo woo to say materialism, even though you're right that the actual empirical evidence is pretty much just extremely limited to zero on both sides. But why does someone get pushed into one camp and another person gets pushed into another? It seems to be somewhat related to like the meaning and the purpose that they find in life. And a lot of when I talk to people who believe consciousness is fundamental, they seem to generate a lot more purpose behind their day from that fact, that they like being a part of this universal consciousness. It gives sort of more just reason to be alive. Whereas I have, always sort of been in more of the material camp, but don't find that in any way devoid of meaning. I just absolutely love learning about science and having conversations with remarkable people like you. And I find it so fun and I find it so meaningful. And even this idea that consciousness emerges or is a property of biological systems in some way, for me, is no more or less meaningful than this idea of consciousness being a property of the universe.
Hmm.
What do you think about that?
I mean, there are temperamental differences and sociological factors. And, there's a philosopher named Richard Rorty who used to say, truth is what your colleagues will let you get away with saying. And so depending on who are the people who are your interlocutors, who are you in conversation with, who do you feel beholden to in terms of wanting to be taken seriously by in an academic
Right.
or professional context, in a research context. That's part of it. We're social creatures and we want to fit in,
Yes.
and we don't want to say things that alienate us from the people we care about or that we want to impress, or and so I'm not reducing it just to that, but I think that's a factor. Had I gone to a different graduate program, maybe I would have held out for a kind of emergentist account of consciousness. But, because in certain graduate programs in cognitive science or neuroscience or whatever, they give you, like you said, 2 minutes on panpsychism and dismiss it. And so you don't want to seem like you're one of those crazy, stupid people who takes that seriously. But
Yeah, it's very true.
But if you're in a philosophy department where, you've got a panpsychist on the faculty and, there's more respectability given to that position, you might explore it a little more and allow yourself to think through it and realize, independent of any sociological factors, that there might be something to this. And so I don't agree with Richard Rorty that truth is just what your colleagues let you get away with saying. On the other hand, I think on some level, as human beings, we're always going to be engaged in these shared inquiries, and it's very important that we not all be forced to, or feel like we're forced to agree with each other. I think I wouldn't be happy about everybody suddenly becoming a panpsychist. Or at least if everyone did, I'm sure almost immediately we'd find a lot of other stuff to disagree about as panpsychists about, okay, well, now what?
Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's healthy that we've got physicalists and idealists and panpsychists and neutral monists and cosmopsychists and whatever other, positions metaphysically entering into this conversation. I think
For sure.
it would not be a sign of health if physicalism were just dominating in terms of philosophy of mind and neuroscience and cognitive science. I think it's good that I'm noticing, and I'm sure you are too, that there are more options on the table now that can be given a fair hearing. That's a sign of progress.
For sure. For sure, yeah. As I said, I'm becoming more radical podcast by podcast. So who knows where I'll be in 50 episodes time. Another area I wanted to touch on is, how do you think psychedelics can inform, what people believe is at the bedrock of reality? Because I don't know how consistent a stream it is, but certainly in people that I've spoken to that believe in idealist consciousness philosophies, they have usually had a pretty resonant psychedelic trip where they have felt firsthand this universal consciousness, and they think they've experienced it themselves, and that has really informed their views throughout their career on this. Is this the case for you?
Yeah. I think before psychedelics, it was more initially like meditation and some sort of just spontaneous mystical experiences. Well, not entirely spontaneous. I mean, as a 11, 12-year-old, I would listen to music in bed at night. Like, it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but like Enya, stuff like that. That's just sort of new agey music, drone music that lifted me out of my body. And I realized that, there's this whole world out there that we see with our eyes, and you close your eyes and there's an inner journey you can go on. And that inner realm of whatever you want to call it, the imaginal world, is seemingly infinite. And so very early on, before I even knew what a psychedelic was, had been exploring consciousness in that way and found it quite compelling. And so later on, when I did try psychedelics for the first time, it was a kind of revelation and a confirmation of what I had experienced just listening to music, which, as William James put it in, over a century ago, that, until we've really taken account of these inner realms of consciousness, we can't claim to have a finished picture of reality or of the universe, just in terms of what can be externally measured, right? There's something else. There's another domain here that is worthy of scientific investigation, and that hasn't, at least in the West, in the modern West, really been looked at.
Right.
And so what psychedelics do is not just, leave you with new ideas about the world, but they transform your perception. Like I was saying earlier, in the way that philosophy, when it's done well, speculative philosophy in particular, is psychedelic in the sense that it's altering your perception. It's not just new ways of thinking about the world. You actually perceive the world differently. Yeah, there's definitely there's no question that there's a before and after with psychedelics, where
Right.
people, they've traditionally been called hallucinogens, because they produce hallucinations, which is to say you see things that aren't really there. But most people, when they've had the experience for themselves, would report what James would call a noetic experience, which is that this was an experience that felt realer than anything else you'd ever experienced. It was more real than real. And, and so there's a kind of revelatory quality to it where it's not that your mind has invented things that aren't really there, like you're seeing pink elephants or whatever. It's like you feel as though you're noticing something about the nature of your everyday ordinary experience that was right under your nose and you had just hadn't attended to it.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you see it and it's obvious and it changes everything. And I've had the experience where that obvious thing that gets revealed is very easily forgotten when you come down, and then you take mushrooms again, and you're just like, oh yeah, there it is again. How
Yeah.
did I forget this? And
Yeah.
what is this? It's something about the non-dual relationality of reality. I think the
Right.
subject-object relationship that is very easy to forget, because when in our normal ordinary state, the object is over there and the subject is over here, and that boundary seems fixed, but it turns out that it's not.
Right. Yeah, I struggle to know during a trip what is a deeper truth or a hallucination, because I can have all of these deep realizations about my life. And, sort of one of the consistent themes that happens for me is that, like, all of the societal bullshit just kind of dissolves. All these social comparisons, all of these, well, my friend is doing this and I'm making way less money than him. Like, God, that's like, all of those rat racy capitalist societal stuff just goes away. I want to be in nature. I have, extreme gratitude for my parents, my family, my friends, all of that. And it does feel more real. And then I kind of look over to the side and my clothes look like an octopus. And I'm like, oh, so it's like you have all these really deep realizations, but then, clearly there is a hallucination aspect where you are seeing things that, because like there wasn't actually, the branches of this tree were not actually violently shaking or dancing or jiving like they look like they are in this moment. So it's like, it's very hard for me to know what's true and what's not, when clearly it is warping every part of your perceptual system, your thoughts. The way of thinking is completely altered, warped, shifted. So I find it interesting when some people have that experience. And, I've talked to, legendary consciousness researcher Christoph Koch, who like had this completely changing, ayahuasca experience, and it shifted his perspective on like 40 years of what he thought consciousness was, which I find so fascinating, because like that almost seems ascientific to me a little bit, to trust your own experience, which sounds weird because like neuroscience kind of teaches you not to trust your own experience. It is a hallucinated prediction of the world that your brain is doing at all times. So I guess that makes me very skeptical of anything that I experience. I think you can have real realizations about your life, but any sort of oneness with the world or connection with the environment, I don't really take as true. I take it as like important and meaningful and interesting, but I don't think it's, while it feels like it is, since again, neuroscience is teaching me that reality, you can't really trust your own experience. Everything is convenient fictions. I struggle to know, what is a deeper reality or what is a hallucination, I guess is a roundabout way of saying that. How do you think you tease them apart? I guess if you don't have the worldview that what the brain does is, a controlled hallucination, it might be easier to trust your experience and trust what you are feeling in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the conscious agents thing. Um, I think it's helpful to think of the brain, our nervous system, as a kind of predictive processor. Um, but then a photon is also a kind of predictive processor, which is to say, if we're going to think of experience that way, um, and we're panpsychist or panexperientialist, then if the very photons that make the world visible to us are also engaged in the same sort of a future prediction process rather than a, accurate measurement of the present construal, then reality is in the making always, not just for us as living animals with complicated nervous systems, but the very photons and electrons and atoms, that the world is made up of at that microscopic level are also processes that aren't fully present at an instant, but engaged in this future prediction activity, right? We're all agents of varying capacities and powers, predictive powers, engaged in the co-creation of reality together, right? And so what's truth and what's illusion in that sort of a context, I think, is a very different type of question. It's less black and white. And, it's a shift out of the way I've talked about it in some of my writing is this Cartesian framework is always going to construe our experience in terms of an attempt to represent something outside of ourselves. The mind wants to represent an external material reality. And so then we have this conception of truth like it's something fixed out there, and we can have a better or a worse picture of it inside of ourselves. That's the representationalist construal. It's informing so much of neuroscience and the hard problem of consciousness and all of that. I think what I'm suggesting is not representationalist anymore. It's more a matter of participation, right? If it's conscious agents all the way down, and it's predictive processing all the way down, what's false now may become true in the future because of the decisions that a large enough collective of those conscious agents make, right? And in some sense, you can think of the evolutionary process as being driven by the collective ensembles that all of these conscious agents are able to form with one another, such that truth is no longer a fixed objective thing we could come to conform with, but rather something that's being manifested and enacted as a result of the shared collective expressions of agency, right? So that when you shift from the representational picture to the participatory picture of what cognition and consciousness are, the search for truth takes on a new meaning, right? It's more of an intersubjective, ongoing intersubjective process of co-creation, rather than I'm an isolated subject trying to know a world that exists apart from me, and I can do so truly, or I could do so in a way that's mistaken. Like, that's too black and white. I think that's a Cartesian picture that needs to be reframed if we really want to step into what's meant by what Donald Hoffman is really saying. I think he's using an old Cartesian epistemology to explain a very new ontology. I agree with the ontological direction he's going, but I think we need to update our conception of what knowledge is, what truth is, so that it's participatory and not representational.
How might we do that, do you think? Because I think one of those, one of the things that's always thrown at panpsychism is, it makes all these cool claims, like the photon is a prediction engine, which sounds really cool. But like, how do we make progress towards falsifying that statement? Or can we?
Well, again, that's falsification is a particular criterion within the philosophy of science that Karl Popper comes up with. Even within the philosophy of science, it's not the gold standard. I mean, if it were, a lot of current research programs would have to shut down because hypotheses and theories get falsified all the time when anomalous data comes in. But because there's so much invested in that research program and that model, they see maybe there's another reason that this theory seems falsified. Maybe we can adjust the free parameters. Maybe we can tinker with the model to bring it into confirmation with what seemed like a falsifying result. But just even leaving the philosophy of science behind, in metaphysics, falsification isn't a useful criterion, because again, like what counts as evidence is going to depend on the metaphysical presuppositions you're bringing to the inquiry. Um, and so can panpsychism be disproven? No, but materialism can't be disproven either. Um, Idealism can't be disproven. It's when you're doing metaphysics, you need other criteria. And some examples of what the criteria might be would be like, well, is this rationally coherent? That is, do the different claims that you're making sort of fit together and give rise to this larger picture? Is it rationally consistent? In other words, are there any logical errors? Another set of criteria could be empirical criteria, like is this adequate to our experience? Does it? If it does conflict with experiments, then that's a problem. There are metaphysical claims that potentially, um, conflict with experimental evidence. But with panpsychism, it's a different interpretation of the available evidence. Just like idealism, if you're doing it well and you're constructing an idealist system or a panpsychist system, it's going to be consistent with all the available evidence. So that's not one of the relevant criteria for determining if it's true or valid. Metaphysics is different than, it's not another scientific hypothesis that might be tested in a laboratory. It's an interpretation of the available scientific evidence in an attempt to understand, well, what are the conditions that make possible the scientific study of nature in the first place?
Right.
Science has philosophical has a philosophical background to it, and to justify science as an enterprise, you need to step outside of science. So I just think it's the wrong question to ask. Can this be falsified?
I don't disagree with that we might need new tools, but what I'm just curious here is like, how do we make progress on it? Or how can we build more of a structure around it where someone might have higher confidence in it, even if it's not, these slam dunk experiments that give us grand revelations and, that discover some objective nature of reality or consciousness, even if it's just building out what the theory really says, or really figuring out what the minutia of the different statements that panpsychism makes, like just building out the information base. Like, how do we do that in a rigorous way? Because that seems like a really tough problem. But if the idea is going to gain more support and gain more ground and get more funding, which I believe it should, we need to be able to kind of figure out how to make progress on it, right? There needs to be some way that we can measure progress in this area.
Yeah. Well, I think one way to measure progress would be, are we as human beings able to come into a different kind of relationship to our scientific knowledge, really our techno-scientific knowledge and power, where because we have this panpsychist orientation to the natural world, we can relate to rivers and trees and other species and soil, and even the atmosphere, not as just a bunch of dead stuff out there, but as, in some sense, well, first of all, an extension of our own living bodies. That like the primary unit of life on this planet is actually the planet Gaia, and we exist inside of this larger superorganism. And so we can continue and should continue to do science in the ways that we have, getting as accurate measurements as possible and trying to come up with the most predictive models, and always constantly refining those models in light of new data. And that affords us a great deal of predictive power. But what science can't tell us is, okay, so how should we interact with the rest of the community of life on this planet? What is our role here as human beings? And I think if you adopt the panpsychist view, not just as a theory, but you think that there really is consciousness in everything, some sort of experience some sort of subjective horizon that is something there's like to be a tree, and that the flow of a river is the expression of some kind of an aim, even if it's diffuse, and inchoate. That agency and subjectivity are not just the private property of human beings, but pervasive. I think it allows us to make a different kind of use of our scientific knowledge and our technological power that might be more conducive to the survival of our species beyond the next century. And so it's a question of worldview and the ethos that follows from taking a view like this seriously. I think there are plenty of like really reductionistic materialists that love the natural world and care for their own families and care for animals and have beautiful gardens. And so, I'm not trying to say that one's metaphysics automatically translates into being a better person or being more ecologically attuned or anything. But I think in large part, our civilization has a more or less materialist worldview, and that's not unrelated to the ecological disaster that we're faced with.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think one of the pragmatic and highly useful takeaways from panpsychism is in ascribing consciousness to everything is just giving everything a bit more consideration, and I couldn't agree with that more. I don't necessarily believe in it, but I think that takeaway is incredibly useful regardless.
And the goal would be, I think, here not just to have it be a belief, but that it would be rooted in experience, and that we would feel, not that we have some way of objectively measuring how conscious this or that is, but that we can subjectively attune to the world in such a way that we have a sense of personal confirmation. Just like when we're communicating with another human being, sometimes we know when we're being heard, and sometimes we know when we're not being heard, we're not being understood. There's not a sense of empathic resonance occurring. We know the difference between when we're connecting with someone and when we're not.
Yes.
Maybe the same thing is possible with, the non-human world. Most people have pets. We can obviously communicate with dogs. There's very clearly inner emotional states, and when your dog's feeling shame and when it's excited and happy. Maybe we can extend that further, and cultivate those sorts of modes of experiential attunement, and so that it's not just, I believe in panpsychism, but no, I feel like that there was some kind of a felt experiential transmission between me and that tree, and that's not just a projection.
Right. No, I totally get it. And it is something that anytime I try and do psychedelics, I feel such an attractive force to trees. I mean, tree hugging comes from a place, right? But I literally find myself hanging out of trees and just absolutely loving trees. Such a strange experience. And it is something that I wish I could carry over more into my, sober states. That love and that magnetic love that I have for the earth. I've done acid trips where I watch Animal Planet for like 7 hours and then donate 500 euro to the red pandas. And it's just like, that will happen frequently enough. And I wish that carried over more. And I think maybe it does. Some of it, surely some of it oozes over, but, and I do think it feels so good to be in that state. So it's almost like I would prefer that whatever philosophically inclined way I would be, I would almost prefer to be that way because I love how that feels. And as I said, I really agree with the takeaway of ascribing consciousness to everything and giving it more consideration of your care. And I would agree that I think if more people thought that way, we would take better care of the Amazon rainforest, and we would care more that to get our palm oils, we need to destroy, acres and acres of land that other organisms inhabit. And I do constantly think about, if everyone just took a day off and did mushrooms, how would the world be a different place? I think that's a seriously interesting thought experiment, of just every single, obviously of age, person did mushrooms. Not everyone, of course, not everyone's going to have the same effect, but like, how would the world be a different place in the months to years to follow?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, uh, I wonder that too, but I also would caution just that, one of my teachers, Stan Grof, uh, who was a Czech psychiatrist and psychedelic researcher, he says psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers.
Right.
And I don't think all psychedelics are the same either. I mean, mushrooms are different from LSD, or it's different from 5-MeO, is different from ayahuasca, MDMA. I mean, there's so many different types of experiences and channels that one can tune into, and some of these substances are often done in ceremonial contexts, which set and setting, right? It changes everything.
Yes.
And
Without
so
a doubt.
I used to think, when I was first reading about the 1960s counterculture and psychedelic activists and everything, that if only we could get some LSD into the water supply in Washington D.C., like we could bring about world peace overnight. And now I'm not so sure about that. I think there's a way in which the context, the set, and the setting matter almost as much as the substance themselves
Yes.
itself.
Choosing
So
to take it, yeah,
mhm.
for sure, rather than everyone being in for. I
Yeah.
agree with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Matt, this has been so much fun. I think you're incredibly interesting. I loved having these conversations with people that really do have a very different perspective on these things than me. And as I said, I'm edging towards panpsychism or biopsychism. You gave me a label for myself now, which I appreciate, because I never really had a label. So now I
There you
can now
go.
I can wear my badge with pride. That's something that I've learned in this. It's been such a pleasure. I think you're so fun to speak to, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Good to talk to you.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free